Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Liturgical series episode. It's been a while since we've had an episode. It's been a busy time, but I'm thankful to get back to this and to talk about something which is very important. And so what I'm talking about today is this idea of ad Orientem worship, as it's often called, which is the question of which way, I guess you could simplify it to which way the priest faces, but not just which way the priest faces, but also which way the people face in worship. Now, we know the early practice in the church was for Christians when praying to the Lord to face towards the east. And this was for a couple different reasons. First of all, to kind of indicate the fact that they were expecting the Lord to return, right? That prayer, in a sense, is part of that waiting expectation of the Lord's second coming. And we know that that was first and foremost in the minds of many Christians in the early church. We hear that in the writings of St. Paul and so on. And so this idea that we face the rising sun because, like the rising sun, we await the rising, the coming of the Lord, who will enlighten the whole world at his glorious second coming. And so this was something that found expression among the Christian people from very early on by facing east when praying. Now, there are different questions of, does this mean that when the early Christians came together for the Mass, that they would all face east? We have no way of knowing that. We know, of course, that the Christians would inscribe, for example, crosses on the eastern-facing walls of the rooms, for example, where they would gather in order to break the bread, as they would call it back then, to offer worship together, that in those places they would inscribe a cross into the eastern-facing wall. So we have already a sense that there's some kind of direction given to this, whether that meant that the presbyter, the priest, faced with the people towards that direction or not. There's good reason to believe that he did. But of course we can't know for sure because we don't have clear records of that time. So that's kind of a separate question. And it kind of brings with it, people will turn to that argument when arguing against facing, all in the same direction. But that's kind of a whole separate thing, right? Because to say that, okay, we need to look at what the early Christians did and do everything they did, well, that would also mean that, somebody confessing a mortal sin would have to join the order of penitence and not receive communion for 7 years, right, before re-entering into full communion with the community. So we don't do that anymore. There's been kind of a valid development of our practice in that field, and there's valid developments of practice in other fields as well. So regardless of whether this was their early practice or not, which I believe there's good evidence that it was, that doesn't determine the question for us. So kind of moving forward, we can ask, well, what's the purpose of this? Well, one of the purposes is what has been mentioned, right? This idea that we're all waiting for the Lord, right? The priest and the people both are waiting for the coming of the Lord. And in fact, when we gather to worship, we are entering into that offering of Christ, which he's eternally making before the Father. And so we're entering into what we expect to come at that second coming of Christ. That fullness of Christ's reign in the world is something that we're kind of just getting a glimpse of in the Mass, right? That, well, really we are actually entering into, but we just don't see it, right? Because it's all kind of hidden under signs. So the signs of bread and wine, which of course do become the body and blood of Christ, but we can't see it. Our senses don't tell us he's there, but our faith tells us he's there, right? So we enter into that by faith, but we believe we're entering into that reality. And so we're already kind of expressing this idea that we're here for the one who is to come. And so we're waiting for, ultimately, as we do this, we're doing this because we are expecting and hoping for and praying for his second coming. Okay, so that's part of the reason. Certainly another part is this idea of when the priest is addressing God, because most of the prayers of the Mass address God. Well, all of the prayers of the Mass address God. Most of the words of the Mass are prayers and therefore address God. And so this sense that the priest addresses God, and so he faces towards God, right? Certainly with the tabernacle there, but whether the tabernacle is in the center of the church or not, this idea that the priest and the people both face towards God in some way. They're facing together, right? It's not that the people are looking to the priest. The people are looking towards God, being led by the priest. So all of this kind of plays into the understanding of why we would worship in that way at all, and has long been the tradition of the Catholic Church to worship in that way for those reasons. Another good reason, which I don't know that I've seen elsewhere, but is brought up by a novelist of all people, a very well-known Norwegian novelist, Sigrid Undset, is this idea. She herself was a convert, by the way. She was a very well-known novelist in Norway, who wrote historical fiction, but she kind of talking about conversion in one of her stories, she talks about a Protestant who goes into a Catholic church not having experienced it before and seeing worship done in this way where the priest is facing towards the east with the people. And she talks about how for the person who enters into that, not having seen it before, it kind of points towards something, and it points to the fact that there has to be some invisible reality here, otherwise none of this makes sense, right? To have the person who's leading everybody facing the same direction as them means that there's something in front of them all, right? There's something else there. And it's not something that's seen, and so it's an invisible reality, which is exactly what we believe at the Mass, right? That we're there for a reality that we can't fully see, but that we know by faith. So again, all of those reasons play into why we would worship facing the east. Or, nowadays a lot of churches aren't constructed with the church facing east with the axis towards the east. And so kind of still this idea of facing together towards the Lord, right? Symbolically, at least. So that's kind of what's behind that. So what happened at Vatican II? Was this just, obviously we saw that essentially almost everywhere the priest turned towards the people in the celebration of the Mass. Was this something just kind of an innovation introduced simply by people who put their own interpretation on Vatican II? Well, not quite, actually. Unlike other things, this was something that we see as something coming from the church. And, we have to go into some detail on that because it can get somewhat confusing. So at the council itself, from the council documents, from the council itself, there's really nothing talking about this, which is somewhat telling, like a change that big. You'd think if that's something the council was moving towards, they would make at least some brief mention of it, right? But there's no mention of it in the council documents. Instead, where we first hear about it is, obviously there was kind of a push towards this, ever since the Protestant Reformation, actually, but where we first hear about it from the documents of the church is in a document put out by a group called Concilium. So this was a group basically formed by the council, after the council, to implement what the council had said. And so that group comes out with a document, kind of a working document at first, saying, look, here are some of the changes you can start doing as we work on the new missal. And then they put out the new missal, so that the missal is kind of what tells you what to say and what to do at the Mass, right? And so right after the council, obviously, we didn't have a new missal right there available. And so this group put out a document that said, okay, here are some of the changes you can start implementing right now, which was, for example, to have all the readings in the vernacular in English here in the US, and several other changes. But one of the things they mentioned, and something that actually ended up in the missal, is this paragraph. So I believe it's number 91 in that document from Concilium. It's number 299 in the general instruction of the Roman Missal. In both places, it's the same wording. It says, the altar, so this is talking about not even necessarily how the Mass is celebrated in this section. It's talking about how the sanctuary is constructed. And so here, talking about the altar, it brings in this idea of how the Mass is, or what direction is given to the celebration of the Mass. And it says, the altar should be built separate from the wall in such a way that it is possible to walk around it easily, and that the Mass can be celebrated at it facing the people, which is desirable wherever possible. Okay, so this is kind of the sentence that has had a lot of debate over it. What exactly does "which is desirable wherever possible" mean? It seems, in the English, it seems very clearly to be referring to celebrated facing the people, right? So celebrated at it facing the people, which is desirable wherever possible. But there are better translations in the Romance languages, such as in Italian, where it's more like that first clause is more separated from the second. So it's something like, the altar should be built separate from the wall so that it's possible to walk around it and to celebrate it at it facing the people. And all of this is desirable wherever possible. So this idea that what is desirable is that the altar be built separate from the wall to make all of this possible. Now, of course, I think no matter how you look at it, there seems to be an implication that the Mass celebrated facing the people is something being brought in by these norms, right? Something almost like a preference, if not definitely a preference. But again, like I said, there was a lot of confusion on that. So a question was asked in the year 2000, and how questions work with the church, if you're kind of trying to formulate a question to clarify an issue, there's kind of an official way of doing that. Is you send a letter to the Congregation for Divine Worship, and you ask a very specific question that receives either a yes or no answer. So you have to ask a yes or no answer question. And so this was sent to the Congregation for Divine Worship. And the question that was sent to them in the year 2000 was this: whether the expression in number 299 of the General Instruction of the Roman Missal constitutes a norm according to which, during the Eucharistic liturgy, the position of the priest versus apsidum, facing towards the apse, or ad orientem is one way people refer to it. So whether that position is to be excluded. So the question is whether, because of this instruction from the Roman Missal, that means that we should not celebrate Mass facing towards the apse, or facing with the people towards God, or facing ad orientem, however you want to talk about it. And the response of the Congregation for Divine Worship is no, it does not exclude that possibility. And then it attaches an explanation. So this is kind of the only official explanation of this much debated line that we have from the church. So I'll just go ahead and read it in full, and then maybe we can talk about it a little bit. So again, it says negative, in accordance with the following explanation. Okay. So the explanation includes different elements which must be taken into account. It is in the first place to be borne in mind that the word expedite does not constitute an obligation, but a suggestion that refers to the construction of the altar separate from the wall. Okay, so expedite is here translated as should be, right? So the altar should be built separate from the wall. So it's not an obligation, but something that is a suggestion. Again, this is the interpretation from the Congregation for Divine Worship of this line. So not an obligation, but a suggestion for that clause should be. And then it says the clause where it is possible, so where it is possible to be constructed in that way, refers to different elements, as, for example, the topography of the place, the availability of space, the artistic value of the existing altar, the sensibility of the people participating in the celebrations in a particular church, etc. So, here the Vatican is basically acknowledging that there could be reasons why it wouldn't be best to build an altar separate from the wall. So, for example, in a church, possibly, one good reason might be that you have a church with a beautiful high altar that's all kind of architecturally built to point towards the high altar. And so maybe in a church like that, it might not be best to add another altar, right? It might be best to use the existing altar that's already beautiful, that's already a focal point. And so on. So there could be different reasons not to build an altar kind of detached from the wall. And those are among some of the reasons. So it reaffirms that the position towards the assembly seems more convenient inasmuch as it makes communication easier, without excluding, however, the other possibility. I think this is a very important line in the interpretation given to us by the church. So this is, again, the Congregation for Divine Worship interpreting this line. And it's saying essentially that this is written because this idea that it's more convenient for the priest to face the people, inasmuch as it makes communication easier. What does that mean? Well, it means simply this, so before the Vatican Council, right, the Second Vatican Council, the Mass would be celebrated in Latin. Many of the prayers were prayed silently by the priest, and the people would often follow along in missals, right? And so what happened is that many churches weren't necessarily built with the idea of amplifying the priest's voice, because that wasn't a necessity in the way Mass was celebrated at the time. And so the idea is that, part of the reason, or in fact it would seem to be the main reason, that this suggestion is given of being able to celebrate Mass facing the people is so that the people can actually hear the priest, right? Which certainly becomes a concern in larger churches or churches with bad acoustics, so on and so forth. But it seems to indicate that the reason for facing the people is not so much a theological reason as much as a practical reason. So that's important to know, and we'll get back to that. So continuing this clarification from the Vatican. However, whatever may be the position of the celebrating priest, so whether he's celebrating facing with the people or towards the people, it is clear that the Eucharistic sacrifice is offered to the one and triune God. Obviously, right? The Mass is offered to God. And that the principal, eternal, and high priest is Jesus Christ, who acts through the ministry of the priest, who visibly presides as his instrument. So it is Christ who leads, who offers the sacrifice at the Mass, even though the visible priest is a priest of Jesus Christ. It is primarily Christ acting in the Mass. Okay, so that's getting at the theology here. And so the liturgical assembly participates in the celebration in virtue of the common priesthood of the faithful, which requires that the ministry of the ordained priest to be exercised in the Eucharistic synexis. So everybody participating at the Mass is able to participate in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, not of the particular priest there. The particular priest there is acting in the person of Jesus Christ, and everybody else is joining in that by virtue of their common priesthood as the baptized in Christ, right? And so the physical position, especially with respect to communication among various members of the assembly, must be distinguished from the interior spiritual orientation of all. It would be a grave error to imagine that the principal orientation of the sacrificial action is towards the community, right? The sacrificial action is offered to God the Father from God the Son. And so it would be an error to think that the sacrifice is being offered to the community. The sacrifice is offered to God the Father, right? And so whatever position the priest is taking, we need to keep that in mind. Now, an implication here, of course, is that the physical position that most clearly expresses that theological reality is facing together towards God, right? In a symbolic way, facing together, and offering that as a community, offering that sacrifice of Christ to God the Father. But it says, even in cases where the priest is facing the people, we need to keep in mind that the sacrifice of the Mass is not a sacrifice offered to the people. It is a sacrifice offered by the people and the priest to God the Father. Okay. So if the priest celebrates versus populum, which is legitimate and often advisable, so if the priest celebrates towards the people, legitimate and often advisable, his spiritual attitude ought always to be versus Deum, towards the Lord, per Jesum Christum, toward God through Jesus Christ, as a representative of the entire church. The church as well, which takes concrete form in the assembly which participates, is entirely turned towards God as its spiritual movement. Okay. So it appears that, this is continuing, it appears that the ancient tradition, though not without exception, was that the celebrant and the praying community were turned versus Orientem, toward the east, the direction from which the light, which is Christ, comes. It is not unusual for ancient churches to be oriented so that the priest and people were turned versus Orientem during public prayer. It may be that there were problems of space or some other kind. The apse represented the east symbolically, right? So even in churches where the church itself couldn't face east, that the apse, kind of the very furthest place of the church in the sanctuary, would symbolically represent the east, right? And we see that nowadays. Today, the expression versus Orientem or ad Orientem means versus apsidum, towards the apse. And in speaking of versus populum, it is not west, but rather the community present that is meant, right? So when we talk about facing east, facing west, more so we're talking about, because not every church faces east and west, we're talking about whether we face symbolically towards the east together, or whether the priest faces symbolically towards the west, towards the people. Okay. So in the ancient architecture of churches, the place of the bishop or the celebrating priest was in the center of the apse, where seated and turned toward the community, the proclamation of the readings was listened to. Now this presidential place was not ascribed to the human person of the bishop or the priest, nor to his intellectual gifts, not even to his personal holiness, but to his role as an instrument of the invisible pontiff, who is the Lord Jesus. When it is a question of ancient churches or of great artistic value, it is appropriate, moreover, to keep in mind civil legislation regarding changes or renovations. Adding another altar may not always be a worthy solution. There's no need to give excessive importance to elements that have changed throughout the centuries. What always remains is the event celebrated in the liturgy. This is manifested through the rites, signs, symbols, and words that express various aspects of the mystery without, however, exhausting it. So no matter how we look at it, how we celebrate the Mass, we never fully exhaust the mystery of what's really going on there, right? Because the Mass transcends those. Taking a rigid position and absolutizing it could become a rejection of some aspect of the truth, which merits respect and acceptance. Okay, so here we see a very balanced position, which talks about kind of some of the reasoning, which is very helpful because we don't get the reasoning here in the germ, but we do get the reasoning here of, why would we have the priest facing the people? It's more of a question of a practical issue because theologically, it seems more appropriate that the priest faces with the people towards God. But because it might be more practical, and it in fact is in many places, for the priest to face the people to allow for that communication in the Mass, right? For the people to hear the priest and then respond to him and so on. That's one of the major reasons, the only reason given here, to have the priest face towards the people. And so that's telling for us, especially in places where, the church is constructed in such a way that it's pretty easy to hear the priest no matter which way he's facing. And also the sense that, if the church is built with a high altar in mind, that maybe there isn't a need to build another altar, right? This is the clarification from the Vatican on this instruction. So it's good to kind of get a sense of that, because if we just read this one sentence, which is really the only sentence we have in the documents that came out of Vatican II on this question, then it leads us to a lot of debate, right? But here's a fairly clear but balanced answer saying, look, you can celebrate Mass either way. Either way is allowed. There's no restriction. But there is a theological significance still to celebrating what many people call ad orientem. And so we get a clearer picture of what this is all about. Now, this has been further talked about as a couple years back by Cardinal Robert Serra, who is the head of the Congregation for Divine Worship now. He himself really recommended that priests and bishops start teaching about this and start actually putting into practice, at least in kind of more of the major churches in each diocese. And so his recommendation is really to allow that position of ad orientem to again inform our understanding of the Mass, because there's so much theological significance to that we don't want to lose. And so, we could talk about this for hours on end, but I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that gives you a better sense of kind of where we're at. It is true that the documents allow for, and in fact seem to prefer, although without giving a particular reason, Mass facing the people. But then the Vatican has come and kind of interpreted that for us as kind of a practical solution. And in fact, if we look at the rest of the germ, we also see that throughout the instructions in the Mass, there are moments where it says facing the people, kind of implying that the priest is not necessarily always facing the people, but rather turning towards the people when he addresses them, which is exactly what happens when you celebrate Mass ad orientem. You're not always facing away from the people, as people would say, or as some people say, but rather you're facing towards God when you address God and towards the people when you address the people, which seems to make a lot of sense. So, wherever you might stand kind of in preference on that issue, hopefully this has given a broader perspective on the reasons for some of these things and on kind of what direction, I would hope that the church would eventually move in a direction of, again, encouraging worship in that way, ad orientem. But we'll see what happens. Let's remain with hearts open and ultimately desiring that the people of God understand the Mass better, no matter what happens or how we offer the Mass in those practical details. So God bless, and if you have any questions or suggestions for another topic, let me know. Hopefully I'll keep making videos, although there may be some time in between each, because these are busy days. So again, God bless, and hopefully see you soon at another video.